What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another datasheet deep dive. This is the video series where we take one datasheet in Warhammer 40k and analyze it in excruciating detail, and today's subject is the Adeptus Sororitas Castigator. Now, this battle tank has been taking the tables of the 41st Millennium by storm since the new Adeptus Sororitas Codex was released, and today we're going to be talking about exactly why that is, the basic profile of the Castigator. We're going to compare its weapon systems, discuss its synergies within the faction and with different detachments, as well as some ways you can try to defeat these metal monsters. And with that, let's dive in. Now, the Castigator profile is a relatively standard, sort of medium battle tank profile. In other factions, this would be the equivalent of a Gladiator or Predator. In fact, it's basically just on the Predator chassis. That means it comes in at an average movement of 10, a relatively resilient toughness 10 with a 3+ save. Fortunately for the Castigator, it does have that Adeptus Sororitas built-in 6+ armor of faith invulnerable save, essentially 11 wounds with an average leadership of 7 and a relatively low objective control characteristic of 3. Now, one of the Castigator's highlights is its special ability, the Rites of Castigation. In your shooting phase, after the Castigator has made its attacks, you can select one enemy that is hit by those attacks. Importantly, that is hit, not targeted. So if, for example, you point a small weapon like a Stormbolter at an enemy and flub all of your shots, you will not be able to trigger Rites of Castigation against them. Until the end of the turn, each time a friendly Adeptus Sororitas unit makes a ranged attack against that enemy, improve the armor penetration characteristic by 1. Little bit of weird wording, it does work until the end of the turn, but it only works on ranged attacks, so important to keep in mind that this effect will not impact your melee attacks. The same enemy unit can only be affected by this ability once per turn, so multiple Castigators cannot stack their AP bonus on a single target. However, one important thing to keep in mind is that multiple Castigators can effectively chain their Rites of Castigation onto separate targets. One Castigator can shoot a single weapon at a target, inflict its Rites of Castigation for the second Castigator to then fire its main cannon at that, gain the bonus of those Rites of Castigation, fire a secondary weapon at a third target, and then the last Castigator can make use of that armor penetration bonus against that target and maybe even stack an additional Rite of Castigation on another unit for the remainder of your army to shoot at. In this way, and because of the fact that Castigators are a relatively inexpensive unit at the time of recording, they are only 150 points, although that may go up in the future. These things can improve the armor penetration of the Adeptus Sororitas army almost across the board. Now, what weapons are delivering this buff? The Castigator comes with a top-mounted turret weapon that can be swapped between an autocannon profile or a battle cannon profile. Both of these have very unique strengths and weaknesses, and interestingly, I think this is one of the examples of a good balance between weapon profiles that the design team has actually come out with. A lot of times a unit will have just one really obviously strong weapon profile. The Castigator, however, has an argument between the both. The autocannons have a rapid fire characteristic. They are a base 4 attacks, however, rapid fire 4 at a range of 48 inches, meaning that within 24 inches, they're firing 8 shots rather than 4. This gives them a much higher attack volume than the battle cannon, although they only get that at a relatively short distance. However, with the Castigator's pretty fast movement of 10 and some other movement buffs that you can source in the faction, like the Triumph of St. Catherine, for example, you can get the Castigator pretty far up the battlefield in order to unlock this ability. But it's important to keep in mind that it won't always be active. On top of that, the autocannons are twin-linked. However, their profile is pretty average. Strength 9, AP 1 for a flat 3 damage. Now, the Strength 9 isn't very good. It's going to be wounding most other medium armor equivalent enemies on 5s. However, that twin-linked characteristic, giving you wound rerolls, makes that a lot more reliable. One important thing to keep in mind is that these weapons are only AP 1, and the autocannon especially is going to be impacted by cover. So firing into an enemy in cover, it's essentially AP 0, meaning that your opponent's going to bounce a lot of these incoming damage. However, if you have multiple Castigators and one of them has already targeted that enemy and hit them, you can perform those Rites of Castigation, give you +1 AP against that target, and those autocannons suddenly become AP 2 and become much more effective against strong armor saves. The Castigator Battle Cannon doesn't need that support quite as much. It has that similar 48-inch range, however, it is a D6 +3 shot blast weapon at strength 10, AP 1 for 3 damage. Fortunately, that AP 1 is is counteracted a little bit by the ignore cover keyword. So this guy doesn't have the same problem that the autocannons do, where firing into a target in cover is going to bounce most of those shots. On top of that, the Castigators have a ton of additional weaponry. They have a Stormbolter mounted on top, which is a good source of rites of castigation. One way that the Castigators often operate is dumping all of their shots into a single target, except for the Stormbolter. You can slow roll out the Stormbolter's attack rolls, rolling its first attack roll, assuming you're only getting 2. Obviously, it's a rapid fire 2 weapon, so within 12 inches, you could get up to 4 shots. Roll the first attack roll. If you miss, you could use a miracle dice, a low 3 or 4 miracle dice from your pool, for example, to guarantee that the second Stormbolter shot hits, and then use that Stormbolter shot to trigger rites of castigation. If you hit the first shot, then you don't have to worry about it, and you're going to be able to inflict those rites, regardless of whether or not that shot actually wounds. It just needs to score that hit. So the Stormbolter is actually incredibly useful for the Castigator to be able to chain that AP bonus down the line. If you need a longer range, however, it also has 3 heavy bolters mounted on its sponsons and its hull-mounted hardpoint. This gives this thing an enormous attack volume. Assuming that you're equipping the autocannons and are in rapid fire range, this guy is going to be shooting 17 multi-damage shots, plus potentially a hunter-killer missile and up to 4 Stormbolter shots as well. Those 17 shots, especially once they start to get those AP bonuses, the heavy bolters have sustained hits, which means you're hitting basically almost all of those attacks that you're shooting. You average around 7 to 8 hits. These guys put out some ludicrous firepower, especially against medium to heavy infantry, things like Space Marines. These will absolutely rinse them down without really any help. And even into harder targets where those heavy bolters are wounding on 5s or 6s, the volume of fire that the Castigator puts out means that 1 or 2 of those will likely go through, and you're also going to be converting several shots from the main cannon, whether that's the battle cannon or the auto cannons. On top of that, it also has a one-shot hunter-killer missile. This thing hits on a 2 at strength 14, AP 3 for D6 damage. The important thing to keep in mind with the hunter-killer missile is that a Castigator, being an Adeptus vehicle, has access to Acts of Faith, so the ability to convert that hunter-killer missile into a successful wound roll or into a maximum damage hit is always present. And while hunter-killer missiles are usually a nice bonus on other vehicles, within the Castigator, it becomes an enormous source of spike damage. Especially if you're shooting at an enemy that has already been rites of castigated, you're going to be shooting at AP 4, potentially ignoring cover if we combine it with some of the other units in the Codex, and hitting on 2s and winning on 3s with a miracle dice in the chamber and punching through most targets' entire armor saves, where you can automatically stack a high value miracle dice in for the damage roll and punch a bunch of damage through on a particularly hard target. This single hunter killer missile is huge for the Castigator's alpha strike potential. Now, the discussion between the autocannons and the battle cannon is very interesting. Generally speaking, the autocannons are going to be the superior choice. The downside that they have against enemies in cover is mitigated somewhat if you are taking multiple Castigators, and also if you are taking the Sororitas Immolator. We'll sort of pair this section with the in-faction synergies section that I typically talk about, but the Castigator autocannons have a huge bonus from the Immolator. Immolators can shoot at a target and selectively remove cover from it, so if you are taking Immolators, which most Adeptus Sororitas armies are, taking 2 or 3 of these things, you can use the Immolator's heavy bolter, for example, to plink an enemy target, remove cover from it, shoot a Castigator at that target to give you +1 AP, and then rip into it with Castigator autocannons from a second Castigator coming in at AP 2, ignoring cover with twin linked. Even against high toughness vehicles that you're wounding on 5s, any of those wounds that convert, which is probably between 2 and 4 after all of the rerolls are resolved, is going to be punching through most targets' armor save, if not putting them on an invulnerable save, and these guys are going to average somewhere around 5 or 6 damage from those autocannons once that combo is enacted, not even including the shooting from the heavy bolter, which can probably convert 1 or 2 more additional shots. For that reason, autocannons are typically taken because of that internal synergy, but the battle cannon definitely has a spot. The fact that the battle cannon fires at full effectiveness at maximum range and doesn't require it to be within 24 inches is a huge bonus. The battle cannon is also a superior initiator of the chain because it doesn't necessarily need the AP bonus that the other Castigators are relying on to get its damage through. So being able to fire that thing first at a target, you don't care whether or not an immolator is already shot, so you can use it to stack the armor penetration bonus on the immolator and then tank it with an immolator, remove cover, and fully combo out this Castigator wombo combo. Means that the Castigator battle cannon is a little bit better as a support piece or a piece to engage in long-range firefights, whereas the autocannons are a little bit more of a brawler. Typically, the standard operating procedure is to focus more heavily on the autocannons, mounting 2 autocannon-equipped Castigators, and then equipping 1 with a battle cannon in order to fulfill that support role. While we're in this section, I think I would be remiss if I hadn't discussed the Triumph of St. Catherine. It's a little silly, it feels like, because the Triumph synergizes with basically the entire codex, but it also has some special considerations with big armored battle tanks like the Castigator. Obviously, it can protect the Castigator with a 6+ feel no pain. It can also buff its relatively mediocre speed of 10, and generating 6s for the miracle pool are good for either keeping the Castigator alive by allowing it to blank incoming damage by plugging in those 6s on its 6+ invulnerable save, or spiking damage with that hunter killer missile like I mentioned before. Well, the Triumph is good basically in every situation. Obviously, the defensive benefits that the Castigator gains from the relics that you choose are pretty significant. So with that combination mentioned, let's dive into some detachment synergies. Castigators are a self-sufficient datasheet. Basically, all of the power that we just discussed from the Castigator is entirely contained within both the Castigator and potentially the immolator datasheet. You don't actually need any additional help to make these datasheets good. However, that being the case, any additional bonuses that you can get from these detachments absolutely sends them through the roof. Probably the least exciting is Penitent Host. Not being a Penitent unit, the Castigator gets very little benefit from the Penitent Host stratagems or detachment ability. The only benefit that it has here is the use of Boundless Zeal to give the Castigator the ability to fall back and shoot. Especially good for the Battle Cannon Castigator, which can't fire its weapon into melee. However, all of the other weapons on the Castigator's profile are not blast attacks, so they can fire into their own melee just fine, or into enemy vehicles that are engaged in melee. Army of Faith is a pretty interesting place for these. The detachment ability of allowing TacticalTortoise units to perform 2 acts of faith is not actually that useful for the Castigator, despite smoothing over some very specific situations where you want to convert its hunter killer missile and also ensure that it's able to rites of castigate whatever you particularly need to. There are not too many situations in which you are using tons of acts of faith with these things. The one way that acts of faith do benefit them, at least in sort of a repeat capacity, is the ability to acts of faith their saving throws, which can allow Castigators and other TacticalTortoise battle tanks to win shootouts with other heavy anti-tank weapons incredibly well. And if you have multiple 6s in your miracle pool, even against AP4 or AP5 shooting, you can act of faith multiple saving throws with auto 6s on that invulnerable save. However, that is not super likely. That said, the Castigator does get big benefits from the stratagems in the Army of Faith. These stratagems can target an Adeptus Sororitas unit in a variety of situations, but you can also create an aura from jump pack units that affects everything within 3 inches of them with the effect of the stratagem, which can be used to affect multiple Castigators. This includes Shield of Faith, which gives you a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, Light of the Emperor, which allows you to ignore weapon skill and ballistic skill characteristic modifiers, allowing you to shoot through -1 to hit, for example, or even the Castigator's own damage value. Blinding Radiance, which subtracts 1 from hit rolls. Basically a slightly worse version of Smokescreen, which the Castigator can also use. It has the smoke keyword, but you can potentially be projecting it as an aura from a jump pack unit, so you can affect several units with it, which could be a little bit of upside. The other big one is Divine Guidance, which gives you +1 AP. That will stack with Rites of Castigation, so you can pull those turret-mounted weapons or heavy bolters up to potentially AP3 and ignoring cover if you have an immolator in the list, which is an incredible amount of armor cracking from these things. In addition, this will also generate you miracle dice if enemy models are destroyed, which is almost certain to happen when you're firing 17+ shots at somewhere around AP2 or 3, which can then potentially supply your miracle dice to keep the Castigators alive on the crackback. This is the one stratagem I should mention that does not get projected as an aura from your jump pack units, at least that we're talking about right now. Bringers of the Flame has some great synergies with big battle tanks, as it does, to be fair, like most of the Sororitas faction. This thing gives you assault on all of the Castigator's weapons, making it significantly faster. If you're comboing it with the Triumph of St. Catherine for an additional bonus to its movement and advance rolls, you can kind of double stack that together, allowing you to advance and benefit from that advance roll bonus on top of the additional movement you're getting, which allows these castigators to get really wild lines of sight along corners of the table that your opponent kind of wasn't expecting. That means that these castigators are going to be very difficult to hide from and can be very aggressive when they need to. They also get +1 strength when they're targeting enemies within 12 inches of them. Excellent for the autocannon equipped castigators. That +1 strength from 9 up to 10 means that they wound a lot of defensive infantry profiles on 2s. They also start wounding other vehicles on 3s or 4s, which with twin linked makes them super efficient. The downside obviously is that you have to be so close to the enemy that those castigators will be in danger in the future if you aren't inflicting enough damage or threatening your opponent enough to not be able to get to grips with them. On top of that, you also have Shield of Aversion, which can give you an Armor of Contempt effect to reduce enemy armor penetration characteristics. That's a big deal for what is ostensibly a medium battle tank that is relatively difficult to kill with Miracle Dice in the pool already. Now, last but certainly not least is the Hallowed Martyrs detachment. This one has huge bonuses for units that are trying to sustain a fight over a long period of time, and that's essentially what the Castigator's trying to do. Castigators really want to be sitting in the back of a Sororitas army and trading shots at that 24-ish inch range band with enemies in the center of the table, or even engaging enemies at a longer distance. That can be buffed by the Blood of Martyrs detachment roll, which gives those Castigators +1 to hit if they are below starting strength, +1 to wound if they are below half strength. This is a situation that Castigators will find themselves in fairly often, given the fact that they are resilient to kill with a pretty solid defensive profile backed up by Miracle Dice, so you can keep them alive when you really need them to. And given the fact that Castigators hit on 3s with no hit bonuses, the one really dangerous part of their attack sequence for the Sororitas player themselves is that hit roll. There's a pretty significant chance that they spike really low on the hit roll, and suddenly their attack isn't going to do anything. Whereas the wound roll will typically be twin linked if you are firing the autocannon version of the Castigator, which means it has a little bit of redundancy that a hit roll doesn't. So taking 1 or 2 damage early on in the game, eating a melt-a-shot somewhere on a Castigator is not the end of the world. They're just going to be able to buff themselves through that relatively mediocre ballistic skill profile. On top of that, you can keep them alive in melee using Suffering and Sacrifice, and even if they go down, you can use Sanctified Immolation for 1 CP to auto-detonate their Deadly Demise, blowing up the Castigator without having to roll for Deadly Demise. That's not super useful since Castigators are kind of your backline ranged elements and will typically be near most of your army, but in the situations where your opponent is swarming over your lines, being able to detonate Castigators in specific situations could be fairly good. So those are all the synergies with Adeptus Sororitas detachments. Let's talk about actually fighting these things. The biggest way to defeat Castigators is removing one part of their combo. Castigators get absolutely ludicrous damage when they have another Castigator buffing their AP value and an Immolator removing cover. At least that's when the autocannons start to do insane damage to basically any target. Trying to get rid of one piece of that, either removing other Castigators or removing Immolators, will dramatically reduce the effectiveness of these things. On top of that, limiting the Castigators to a single target so they can't stack their AP bonus, their rights of castigation, is another important consideration. Castigators get incredibly strong when they start to be able to concentrate their fire on a single target, because they'll then benefit from the rights of castigation applied by the previous Castigator. If each of your opponent's Castigators can only shoot at a single unit, they won't be able to affect each other with that AP bonus. The nice thing about the Castigator profile for the Sororitas player is that they have a high volume of kind of medium strength attacks, which is one of the perfect profiles to get these characteristic bonuses to. And if you can limit how often those apply, you're going to be significantly limiting their damage. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the Castigator profile is actually pretty good at killing the Castigator profile. One thing that you don't want to do is try to rely on sort of traditional anti-tank to kill them. It's really inconsistent into Adeptus Sororitas, so relying on things like Volcano Lances or Rupture Cannons to try to down these things will oftentimes just run into the solid wall of Miracle Dice, especially if the Triumph of St. Catherine is in play, which, let's be honest, it probably is because of how strong it is in the the Adeptus Sororitas Codex. Any one of those shots going through that converts into the saving throw will get automatically miracled out thanks to those automatic 6s in the miracle pool. So relying on higher volume, lower impact weapons is definitely going to be the way to go to get rid of these models. Now, you have to keep in mind that if they are in Bringers of Flame, they will have access to Armor of Contempt potentially, but they won't be able to use that army-wide. And if you can get lines of fire onto multiple Castigators, you can probably get around the use of that stratagem. Otherwise, Castigators are a fairly standard medium battle tank, so anything that can deal with that stat line is going to be good against them. Outside of what we've already talked about with Miracle Dice and Shield of Aversion, they don't have any unique defensive characteristics over, for example, something like a Space Marine Predator. But if you have any special experience defeating Sororitas Castigators, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.